All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to East Texas Men. Joining us today is Scott Austin Martin.
Hi, guys.
Um, Scott, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've got a company here, East Texas Stress Reduction Clinic. I'm a licensed professional counselor with a history of also being a licensed massage therapist. So I came through kind of counseling with a body-based kind of understanding, which really headed me into the direction of how to work with somatic therapies, specifically on how to process trauma and anxiety in the body, very specifically. So I don't know, even though I do go cognitive behavioral therapy for a lot of things, and I use a lot of different techniques, a lot of what I do is much more practicing presence, mindfulness based, showing people how to shift the way that the brain tissue literally is activated and how we see our reality, and how to down regulate or decharge with resolution, sometimes even generational trauma that affects everything from the people that we're attracted to the way that we show up in life and the patterns of behavior that we kind of enact in. So that's the short tour. I do a lot of different types of things with people depending. Relationship transformation is kind of my biggest niche, where I bring a lot of Gottman material, a lot of emotion-focused couples therapy, things that are kind of science-based, but generally everything I do with relationships is normally trauma-based, because when you heal the trauma, people show up in a completely different way in their relationships.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And so East Texas Men, we want to raise awareness for men's health issues, mental health being a big issue that men face. And sometimes there's a stigma for men reaching out, especially if they've experienced trauma. A lot of men carry around unresolved trauma. And so I just wanted to speak with you today to talk about how men can get help, how men can overcome the stigma of getting help, and what sort of resources are available to men in East Texas to handle their trauma-based issues, whether it's relationship or past trauma or, things that may have affected them in their lives.
Sure. Well, I want to address kind of mental health stigma first, just for a moment. Mental health stigma, if we really look at it in its simplicity, means that we put on a veneer or a facade that says it's not okay that I'm not okay. And one of the key aspects of treating trauma is that you cannot leave a place that you've never been. So as human beings, we have advanced prefrontal cortexes that basically have advanced memories and incredibly advanced imaginations that we use to beat the crap out of ourselves from, even a conditioned generational way. I mean, what we mean is, we now know that children of Holocaust survivors are prone to PTSD and anxiety, not because they've been through the same traumas, obviously, but because they're modeled the triggers. So there's a lot of very specific defensive mechanisms that get modeled and then conditioned and then become a part of our social norm for a lot of people. And so when we look at saying it's not okay to not be okay, we use these incredible brains to build huge mental strategies to hide that, so that we never actually look at what, quite honestly, is natural for the body to heal if we got the mind out of the way. So the aspect of doing trauma work is specifically using the mind in a specific way to get the mind out of the way so the body can do what it naturally does, which is unwind the neural system from trauma. Human beings, we intersperse that through levels of story, and this is okay and this is not okay, and a lot of it is simply just not true. And so we never allow ourselves to actually look at the issue, which you cannot leave a place if you haven't been there. So it's really important that we make it okay to not be okay, so that we can heal what is generations of trauma that's showing up all over society right now. So how do people get help was, I think, your next question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As dark as a lot of people think that these times are, with a lot of polarization, I think that we have a world of duality where whenever there's a certain amount of darkness, there's also a certain amount of light. Right now, there are so many ways to heal that people don't know about. It's insane. And in fact, I can confidently say that for every one thing that I learn, There's 99 other things that I haven't learned yet. There are so many amazing people on the planet and so many new ways to heal. The problem is that what we've learned, like the research actually tells us, and its implementation in mainstream America, it's taking 10, 15, 20 years for it to get us to get what we've learned into people's hands. And so what does that mean? Well, one that a lot of people know about is some form of a practice of presence, mindfulness. And there's a lot of different varieties and there's a lot of different ways to go about that. Let's discuss that just for a moment, how important that is. The brain's going to do what the brain expects to do. That's known as the Tetris effect, all right? So if it's only used to being in a story of suffering, what we now know with fMRI brain scans is when people are in a narrative, and that's what our advanced memories and advanced imaginations allow human beings to do, is to be in an advanced abstract reality of either the past or an abstract reality of the future, or even be in an abstract story of now where we're imagining what people are thinking and doing. So that abstract ability, it does allow us to, look at things from 360 degrees, how we approach it, how we move away from it. Is there a better way? So that allows us as human beings to control our environment, but it's also a double-edged sword that it creates, we stay in that story. We're lost in a narrative. So we're actually in the story of our lives and not actually in our lives. So a practice of presence is where we're learning how to actually bring ourselves out of that story and into the present moment. And the science is showing us that when we do that, there's a completely different type of brain activity that lights up the human brain. And the more that we stay within that experiential mode of the brain activity, neurons that fire together, wire together. And like, for example, an 8-week mindfulness-based course has pre and post fMRI brain scans showing an increase in gray matter tissue in the prefrontal cortex and areas associated with executive functioning, emotional regulation, and self-referential systems. We see a decrease in white matter, specifically around the amygdala, which is associated with how we process inhibition, fear, pain, these type of things. So white matter, what is that? That's connective tissue. Well, what is that? That's triggers. We are literally physically decreasing our triggers by conditioning how we use our brains on a daily practice of showing up. That means we have the ability to do brain surgery with the practice of meditation or mindfulness or presence or centered prayer. I mean, there's a lot of different variations depending on what language and how you come at of how we can use our brains in a very specific way. And it will literally begin creating a new neural cow path that will begin doing that automatically, that we can enjoy the benefits that will bleed through our life. So practice of presence, first thing, very important. Look it up. I mean, seriously, you can Google just about anything these days. There's so many courses. There's so many resources that are on YouTube, you name it, or come find us. We'll tell you more about it as well. We can talk about that. But there's a lot of really amazing practitioners in the area if people aren't afraid and they're not using that facade, because once you downregulate these defense mechanisms, that's energy that goes back into your life. It flows you back into an authentic state of energy-rich life that you can use that energy that was being used for anxiety for creating the life that you really want. So presence is one big part. The second part is trauma. And I use that term very loosely, and there's a lot of practitioners that don't agree with the way that I use that term. When I use the word trauma, I'm talking about any time in the past, either modeled or we've went through an actual trauma, and it's a level of degree. So it can be emotional conditioning, trauma little t, trauma big T. So it's everything from I didn't get what I wanted on my 7-year birthday party, right? To I saw my best friend die in my arms in Afghanistan. It's the same mechanisms, and what they are is they're like 4 different mechanisms of fight, flight, freeze, or disconnect. Okay, so those 4 different aspects are different ways that trauma can have an effect. And when we look at anxiety, and I know we can go to the DSM, we can see all these different definitions. For simplicity's sake, there's 2 different reasons why we have anxiety. One, because you're actually in danger, and that's a really helpful signal, right?
Absolutely.
Two, anxiety means that there's been some upregulation of the autonomic nervous system, right, that has gone up and it hasn't completed that cycle of trauma yet. Anxiety is a symptom that actually exists, and it's actually showing you what needs attention. And so from a body-based, we have now learned that somatic techniques are something that is incredibly effective, and we can rapidly get in touch with the body in a certain way to actually complete those cycles of trauma very, very quickly. And so, when we look at the history of mental health, the majority of people out there have been trained in some form of cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive light. And I wouldn't even say that all therapists actually use that. A lot of times they're using a lot of reflective listening, and they're doing a little bit of cognitive light as well. So the reason why that, even though it is incredibly efficacious, the reason why it doesn't work so much, and the clients that come to me frequently, it's how intelligent they are and how good they are at arguing with themselves,
Right.
Is because it's only coming in through the realm of thought. And if you're already really good at being in an abstract reality, then you can be in the story all day long and not actually approach reality. I mean, you can be in a rationalization, like it's rational that there are gods on Mount Olympus. That you can rationalize that. That's how that stuff comes about. It doesn't mean that it's true. And so when we look at what's actually true, bringing our attention to things like the breath, the sensations of the body. And the sensations of the body is a really, really helpful place for working with trauma, because, and this is the simplest step, description that I can give to people. You have a thought. It's a chemical messenger. It sends a signal to the hypothalamus, where it creates a neuropeptide that's released through the pituitary gland, travels through the autonomic nervous system, where to a plexus of nerves, normally a hormonal center of some sort, where it broadcasts a signal that we know as an emotion. The thought creates the emotion. Well, there's a thing that's known as an emotional refractory period. So that's how long it takes for that to occur, which is only about 90 to 120 seconds, which means you have to keep having the thought in order to have that sensation. But don't be fooled. It's in the body that we experience the discomfort. So there are patterns that we can look at. And of course, we're all very special and subjective. But when I'm working with people, one of the first things I ask them is, where are you experiencing that in the body? And as we take a look, there are patterns of how that shows up with the way that we just described it. And here are some of the common ones, although there's certainly a large variety of other ways, all right? In the head, this frequently has to do with control or confusion. Temporalis muscle, TMJ, levator scapula, worlds of my shoulder. I have no control, or I'm confused, therefore I have no control. If it's in the neck, frequently moving down into the chest here, and we see this a lot with childhood trauma, sexual trauma, or scenarios where we're simply not allowed to express authentically what we'd really like to say. A little bit of that in the political landscape for sure.
Right.
And then down here in the chest, whole bunch of things going on in the chest. One of the first ones is anger, which can be like tight bands across the chest. You can see how that can compare with control pretty easily. So we can experience a lot of things in the body. And then anger is always hiding what? Pain, suffering, heartbreak, heartache. So we now know 2 different studies showing that heartache or heartbreak is a signal from the brain into the vagus nerve in the neck, chest, upper digestive that feels like a giant gaping hole or a wound, or like an elephant sitting on our chest. And then we go down here in the solar plexus. You see somebody, unless they're cold, of course, going like this. What is this telling us? Don't take my power. There's a social phobia or an insecurity or something about somebody's taking my power in some way. So when I'm working with somebody, I'm watching eye movement, voice and fluctuation, facial expression, body language, all of the nonverbal cues that's showing me what's actually going on. And one of the first questions when I ask them, where do you feel that? Here's a response a lot of people give me. And it's really interesting that you can kind of hear this really quickly. I said, well, where do you feel it? And they go, well, in my head. I'm like, okay, is that in the abstract concept of the mind, or is there a physical sensation in the head? And you will literally see some people go, like, because they just rewired to pay attention to the sensation. What does that tell you? It tells you they're in the story, right? And so this is why a practice of presence becomes very, very important, because we need to begin this. This is the actual exercise that we're strengthening. You got to start with 5 pounds in the gym, and then you move up to 10. And so there becomes a real reason for there to be a practice or a discipline or a diksha every day that you commit to. People look at that and they go, well, I'm not doing anything. Well, the science tells us that's not actually true. We're actually shifting neurotissue in the brain to begin holding our reality in a completely different way. So it becomes important for us to then do detective work in a safe place, giving the client an enormous amount of power. so that we can do a certain amount of detective work to figure out what are the touchstone memories, or there's an Indian word, samskaras, of how we've upregulated in the past and we haven't completed those cycles. And there's only so many of those stories. They generally appear in categories like, there's a table, it's an issue, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not desired, these type of things. And those tables are held up by actual legs, events, or modeling that has occurred within our lifetimes that have conditioned us in this way. And so, for example, EFT, emotional freedom technique, is also known as tapping, is specifically a way that we use exposure therapy to bring up a event or a way that we're feeling something, to identify it and to measure it, a subjective units of distress, a SUDS, 0 to 10, after we've identified kind of a descriptor of, is it heavy, is it tight, is it burny, like what's the juicy word for you? And we can go through an event, and there's a way to approach events as opposed to what the ridiculousness we used to know of as prolonged exposure technique, which 80% of therapists wouldn't use because frequently it's like doing surgery without anesthesia. There's a way to approach trauma so that you put out a little bit of the fire, put it out, get a little closer, get a little closer, get a little closer. And so what we now know with tapping, for example, and this is acupressure. And they used to describe this with like meridians in a way that a lot of people just could not really understand. The theory with EFT is that we are inputting a piezoelectric signal. We now know that through certain studies that when we do acupressure, there's a certain correlated neurological effect that begins happening in the prefrontal cortex. So if you feel a certain moment in a certain part of the body and we're inputting acupressure, we're literally physically interrupting that signal from the brain to where it's being represented in the autonomic nervous system, allowing there to be a break in that pattern. And then the triad of change of focus, language, structure. Focus, language, structure. If you're stuck in one of these and you create movement in the other two, you will get movement in that one. And so this allows for there to be a down regulation, but we're also looking for resolution. So frequently in the way that we set up that protocol, you'll see us going from one side to the other, of going, yes, it is, no, it isn't, yes, it is, no, it is. We'll examine it from different areas while we're also working with a new stimulus that we're inputting, which gives us choice. And normally resolution means we've got to examine a faulty choice in our belief system in some way where it's not okay that this is the way it is. Well, if it's not okay, then we're literally sending like an incoherent signal through our autonomic nervous system using our life force to say this is not okay. Well, what if it's something you can't control? And now you're resisting something you can't control.
Right, right.
Exactly. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Similar somewhat to, but it's actually when they're put up side by side, EMDR, much more effective long-term setup also. So it got actually better results. Not saying that EFT isn't EFT, 57 veterans of post-traumatic stress disorder did 6 group sessions together with the tapping, all right? After those 6 sessions, over 80% of them no longer met the criteria for symptoms of PTSD. That study's been duplicated, all right? So we know how to facilitate the healing of trauma. The problem is most of the world doesn't know about it yet. EMDR, Francine Shapiro, a magnificent woman. It's such an amazing therapy. It really is a dance that the practitioner learns how to do. It's interesting to see how people work with it in different ways, but there is very set protocols. The basis of it, if I could describe it quickly, is we're basically using bilateral stimulation in the same aspect of exposure therapy to where we're getting the 2 different hemispheres of the brain to connect in such a way that it only really takes a certain type of processing of the body connecting and sharing resources in a certain way for there to be a down regulation of the way that we're holding that particular memory. And memory is often held with the neural charge that's in the body. And so if we've upregulated and the body is still holding on to that, even if it's below the surface, then it's going to affect the way that we hold that memory. It's one of the most amazing things to be an honor to be a part of, is to sit there and watch a memory actually fade, go from color to black and white, or the expressions in a snapshot of that memory to completely change rapidly in just a few minutes. So I would advise people to look up Psychology Today, look up any therapist that says that they do EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's fantastic. And with trauma, do this. Go see somebody that resonates with you. And after you've had one session, if they don't still resonate with you, then run. Like go find somebody else, because there are a lot of really amazing practitioners that are out there.
I think that's important too, finding the right person that you can relate to and connect with. I think that makes a big difference. And I just want to say thank you, such informative information. So you have so much knowledge around the issue of mindfulness and presence. And a lot of what you're saying is, it reminds me of this meeting we had last month, was Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we watched the trailer called The Mask You Live In. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it talks about how boys are conditioned to wear these masks to hide their true, authentic selves. They're not able to express that, like you're saying. They're not, so they live inside these stories of, I can't cry, I can't be weak, I can't be feminine, you know, or I'm going to be seen as less of a man, or I'm going to be seen as some form of female genitalia or something like that, you know. So a lot of what you're saying correlates with me and how I see the socialization of masculinity that a lot of boys face at a young age, where they're not allowed to express their true authentic selves, and it gets repressed and suppressed. And so they grow into men who have a hard time with their emotional expression, or their ability to communicate or have a language for their emotions, or what's going on inside of them. And I think a lot of what you've said to me resonates with me. Is it's a lot of inner work that's going on with the body that, like you said, it all formulates in the mind pretty much.
So how about we do this? Let me mention just a couple of other therapies real quick. And then why don't we stop this, and then we'll do kind of a part B where we talk a little bit more about this, because this is an area that needs some expansion. If people are interested in listening to part B, then you can make that available as well.
Okay.
But what I want to mention is, and there's not as many practitioners in this area, there's another technique, Peter Levine, it's called SE, somatic experiencing, also another body-based type of trauma approach. Focusing, that you can find a book on it. It's an amazing way of visualization, working with the felt sense. In the 1970s, Dr. Eugene Gendlin at the University of Chicago got a bunch of psychotherapists together, and he asked a really, really important question. The question he asked was, why does psychotherapy not work when it doesn't work? Isn't that a great question? Just a fantastic question. And so they basically started listening to a lot of their sessions, and in the qualitative data, they identified that there was a characteristic that people had that tended to get better, that people that didn't have this characteristic did not tend to get better. And then they asked an even better question: can we teach people how to have this characteristic, and will that predict them getting better? And the answer was yes. So what was the characteristic, right? The characteristic is, whatever your story of suffering is, what is the felt sense of that story in the body? The felt sense. And so that basically led to the creation of focusing, which is a very specific, it's another type of technique of working with somatic. Probably my favorite, and the one that I work with and the majority of my clients, is another one that's called Somata Respiratory Integration, which is based off of the work of Dr. Donnie Epstein. And it's the 12 stages of healing, not to be confused with the 12 steps. 12 stages is, it actually explains that there are seasons to healing, with the first 3 just being discovery, a certain amount being transformation, and another part being kind of an awakening as well. I would advise anybody to look that information up and find anybody that does anything close to that work as well. It's really, in my opinion, like the biggest hot tub of multi-perception, of shifting and melting into what I call flow. And flow means it takes no effort for me to be me, right? But what we do is we come into this world in the state of joy and ease, then almost immediately, through culture or belief or whatever, or an actual trauma, we go from, you know, the state of flow, which I call a cup of joy and ease, and the world gives us a little bit of trauma, so we upregulate into fight, flight, freeze, or disconnect in order to have a defense mechanism. And so we like control, right? So we stay with that upregulated pattern of defense, which is also trauma. And so neurons that fire together, wire together, and this new place of felt sense of identity becomes our homeostasis of who we believe that we are. Now, is it a state of flow? No. And there's a lot of people that don't even know or haven't experienced what that actually feels like, because generational trauma has created so many of these, especially post 9/11. I mean, there's so many aspects of society that create these little patterns. And so what we want to do is show people how to downregulate back into a state of flow. That's our general goal with the people that I'm working with. And it has effects on the way that we show up in a relationship. And we're going to talk about that in part B. Anything else you want to say to finish up this section?
If you just want to give some information on how to get in contact with you for part A, and if people want to join us in part B, they can go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I'm assuming that you're going to post this with your Instagram as well.
Yeah.
So that's where this
Yes.
will be available. And you can give the information and links underneath this. If
Okay.
you're interested in contacting me, if I can answer questions for people, you can reach out at etsrc.org, which stands for East Texas Stress Reduction Clinic. And there's ways to get in touch with me that are there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Scott, and we'll see you in part B.